Okay, welcome back to my brief-ish history of progressive rock. I feel like this will probably be the most popular of all the videos because we are talking now about the 70s, the heyday, the big bang of progressive rock. You know, we had the initial thought, we had all of the items coming in to create the big statement, and now we are here. We're in the thick of it. Things are happening. So, if you missed the first one, I've got the first one up there. I've also created a playlist for this, which will have all 7 episodes, which I'm really excited for. If you haven't seen that first video, I highly recommend that you do because I cover a little bit of housekeeping. The first one that I just want to reiterate is that even though I'm going to be doing, a little bit of a deep dive into this, I'm not going to get to everything. I can't, it's like the perfect map is a 1-to-1 and it's essentially useless. The perfect history is a 1-to-1 and is also essentially useless. So there will be bands that I won't be able to be covered just because A, I wouldn't know about them, but B, I don't have the time for it. I'm also not going to be covering some of the big musical expressions and some of the big tangents of progressive rock. I'm going to be doing my best, but I know I'm not going to be able to get to everything. So in this video, I'm going to at least touch upon album styles such as Zool, as the Canterbury scene, and as like the Italian progressive rock, but I'm not going to do like a deep dive into those. I'm just going to be looking at more of like what progressive rock meant in the 70s, and then, later on how that influenced music going forward, specifically in the Western side of things. So, yeah. Know that going in. Also, I'm going to get things wrong. This was just meant to be a fun little exercise for me. So if I make any mistakes, if I talk offhanded, just let me know in the comments. Be polite. Be nice about it. We're all humans. We all make mistakes. If you've never made a mistake before, you're not human. That's just it. The human condition is to make errors. So let's be kind to one another. Let's correct. And that's how we're going to go forward. Okay. That all being said, let's talk about progressive rock. And I'm going to do my best to stick to my script and not go off onto Pluto like I did in the last video. I'm sure it's fun and I have a lot of fun doing that, but come on, focus in. Let's go. So, Part 1 is the birth of progressive rock, the pioneers and innovators. We already had King Crimson in the past, right? King Crimson, 1969, In the Court of the Crimson King. This was the album that opened up everything for everybody. This was the final permission that was needed in order to don't have a preconceived notion of what music needed to be okay taking influences outside of the rock or outside of the convention. That was what In the Court of the Crimson King really allowed for things to happen. So this is where you get bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, Genesis, Gentle Giant, and Vandergraaf Generator. Like I find like the first handful of years of the 70s, that's where the pioneers and the innovators took place. So we're looking at 1969 to about 1971, maybe even 1972. This is where a lot of this unearthing and experimentation is going on. This is where I'm going to maybe 1.5, which is bands that were in the 60s and continued on and kind of moved themselves into more of a progressive rock framework. We're looking at bands like Jethro Tull, like Deep Purple and Uriah Heep. Black Sabbath continued on. We get Led Zeppelin at that point. Later on, we'll have other bands in that vein, but that was kind of like the seeds of metal being dropped at that point. But also bands like Pink Floyd, Yes, and Genesis. Like all these bands already had established albums, but I felt like they were flirting with different styles of rock at that point, like I feel like Pink Floyd was doing more of the psychedelic and acid rock. Yes was doing more of like a symphonic rock. Genesis was just doing Genesis. We're not quite sure what From Genesis to Revelations was doing. But like, they were trying those things, and then once the 70s hit, they were basically given permission to do what they were born to do. And so in the 70s, that's where you get that transition more into proper progressive rock. I feel like the only one that never really stuck the landing, and I don't mean this as a criticism, are bands like Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd. That Pink Floyd always had that kind of experimentation. They always had that really psychedelic strain on them. But 1970 saw Atom Heart Mother, which is more of a prog piece that saw metal that also continued with that vein. And then in the mid 70s, that's where you get Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, that are much more of the prog landscape in that sense. And Jethro Tull, similarly, kind of did a couple, prog works, Aqualung, Thick as a Brick, Passion Play, Too Young to Die, Too Old to Rock and Roll. But I feel like that was more of like they were just sampling the style and then moving on, right? So that's where this kind of innovative and pioneers happened. This moves us now to part 2, the second wave of progressive rock and the first death, mainstream and satirization of progressive rock. So this is where we're coming from the early 70s into the mid and later 70s. So bands started to creep up that, and this is why I say this is where the second movement of progressive rock was. There was less of the innovation that was going on and more of the emulation. So this is where we get bands like Camel, Starcastle, Rush, even within more of the krautrock of like Triumphirat, Tangerine Dream, and then over in, like, say, America, the USA, with Styx, Kansas, Boston, ELO, where being progressive rock was very in, right? So a lot of bands were taking the progressive rock landscape and incorporating it into their rock sentimentality. And we did get a lot of that overproduced, very symphonic, very big, very, show-offy kind of music. And I love it all. I'm not saying this as a negative. I'm saying this as a very big and clear positive, but this is also the second wave. And with bands like Rush that still did some innovation work, they were still leaning on their influences. Chris Squire was a huge influence for Geddy Lee. And he's mentioned, like, hey, a lot of what I did for Yes, or what Yes did for me, I wanted to incorporate in the music. So, that's where we get some of that progressive rock landscapes in there. And then you get a band like Starcastle that really was like a little bit of a clone band at that point. So yeah, I feel like we oversaturized the market, and that's where we got a little bit of the backlash to progressive rock and where we begin to enter the initial and inevitable death of progressive rock in the late 70s. But yeah, there was just like everybody was doing prog landscapes, the longer stretches of music, and you can still feel that today. You can still kind of feel that influence from today. But yeah, and even with bands like, Genesis that were kind of pulling back from the big progressive rock landscape with albums like And Then There Were Three, which still was quite complex, but not quite prog. You had albums from Yes, like Tornado, which once again, pulling back from the prog, but still very much complex. King Crimson at this point had basically thrown in the towel, as well as bands like Gentle Giant. The last 2 or 3 records from Gentle Giant wasn't really innovative anymore. They were kind of derivative of themselves. Still good music, but they weren't really pushing the boundaries like they were in the past. And same with Vandergraaf Generator. So all these bands started to kind of implode upon themselves. Emerson, Lake and Palmer was kind of gone for that point. They basically, once again, imploded upon themselves. And it was one of those things that, thinking back, it's one of those, they shined so bright that the star exploded. And there were a lot of casualties to the supernova. And because of that, when I talk about it in my next video in the 80s, people were almost scared to use the progressive rock landscape. They were terrified to be labeled as prog because they exploded in upon themselves. Musical styles like hair metal, glam metal, punk, and all that kind of did away with the big production experimentation and wanted to strip it back, especially within the UK, to the bare bones. It was just, no, let's see what music we can play with the least amount of production side behind it. In this time, though, in the mid 70s, this is where we have part 3, the subgenres. This is where we have Zool within Magma, Canterbury Scene within Caravan, and Italian prog, like PFM, where all these bands and subgenres was seeing what was going on in the early 70s and was like, we can do this very differently. We are going to just take this to the extreme in one case. Zool took it in a very experimental side of things. The Canterbury Scene took it in a very minstrel side of things. And Italian prog took it in their own culture side of things. And I almost wish, I do wish, that essence was found in other styles as well. I would have loved to see, and we saw it a little bit with Obasai, I believe that's how you pronounce it, with more of like an African style of music. Love Obasai, one of my favorite rock bands of the time. And again, we found it with a little bit more of a funk flavor. And this is where I want to kind of pivot even into part 4, which is prog being found outside of prog. And this is specifically in the styles of the 70s. So we were already talking about the American prog within Styx, Kansas, Boston, and ELO, but I would argue that genre, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, I'm already seeing the red flags on the field being like, don't do it, don't do it. I'm going to do it. Disco is also inherently prog, because disco, even though it's a dance-first kind of style of music, listen to Donna Summer's take on, I almost said Jurassic Park, MacArthur Park. The 20-minute long suite that's on her, like the one album that I have from her, that's prog, man. Like, it's the build-ups, it's the payoffs, and that, in essence, is prog. Prog is the build-ups and the payoffs. It might not necessarily have the complex rhythm styles, even though if you get down to the brass tacks, some of the disco stuff has some pretty intense rhythm styles. It might not necessarily have the deviation of the verse, chorus, but, some of the dance music of the time, they didn't even have verse, chorus. It was just the music. It was just the grooves and the rhythms and flows. So I will say that disco is prog in that they hold that tenet of progressing the music forward, because if you didn't progress the music forward, it would stagnate. And stagnation is the antithetical essence of disco. Disco always is shifting, it's always changing, it's always developing, and that's what makes it so exciting. So yeah, you could see prog being experimented with and really being played even within the funk landscape, in the big band landscape within the 70s. That is all being found within the progressive rock landscape. So yeah, let's move on to part 4. Part 4, sadly, is the death of prog, bands throwing in the towel. And I've already mentioned this. A lot of these bands either completely disappeared, like King Crimson, ELP, Vandergraaf Generator, Gentle Giant, or they pivoted into new wave, into pop, into synth work, and we're looking at bands like Rush, like Yes, like Genesis, and even Pink Floyd. I think the last big prog album from all these guys was maybe in the year of 1980 specifically. You had Duke from Genesis, you had Drama from Yes, you had The Wall from Pink Floyd, but then they would follow it up with arguably their least prog albums. You had Abacab from Genesis, you had 90125 from Yes, and you had The Final Cut from Pink Floyd. So even bands that were at like the peak of and at the beginning styles of prog were dying out, they were transitioning. The nails were in the coffins at that point, and we don't even see new bands of that time coming out of the woodwork and flying the prog landscape. They were definitely burying the flag. They were done. And that brings us to the 80s. So this one was a little bit of a quick one. The last one, I think I spent a little bit more time on the housekeeping. But that is where the 70s left us off. And much like a big bang, the echoes can still be heard. And so we're going to be talking about some of those echoes in our next video. That is the 1980s, or as I've called it, the wasteland. There was still prog going on in the 80s, though, and I think that's, I think we've missed some of that, and I want to get really deep into where prog found itself, both within the capital P prog, but also in the lowercase p prog as well. So hope you'll join me for that, and I hope you guys are enjoying this video series. I've been having a ball. I just finished editing the first episode. It's being uploaded as we speak. Can't wait to record some of the other ones, because once we get into like the 90s and the 2000s, that's where it gets really, really interesting for progressive rock and prog music. So yeah, I hope you guys will join me for that, and I hope you guys are having a good time. So that's where I'm going to leave you for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Let me know of anything that you think I missed, anything that you wanted me to cover. What were some of the bands that you wanted me to feature that unfortunately didn't make the cut? I've got one behind me because I absolutely love these guys, but I didn't know quite where to put them. I didn't even talk about the Canadian prog, like Harmonium, like Cano, like Klaatu, those really big progressive Canadian rock bands, even Saga, we were still feeling that. But I wanted to give a little bit of a roadmap, a little bit of a landscape to show just the influence of progressive rock in the 70s so we can move forward. So yes, thank you all so much for watching. Obviously, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.